David Jeffries, formerly Chief Executive of the Medical Devices Agency, with over 30 years' experience of regulation in both the device and the pharmaceutical sector. And I've been asked today to give an introduction to the important new regulation which has been put forward for medical devices and for IVDs. During the course of this year, Management Forum will be organising a major workshop on this topic to be held in May, and are also going to present aspects of this important legislation at other workshops and conferences throughout the year. So please look at the website and you will find a lot of information to keep you up to date on this very important area. Two texts were issued by the European Commission in September. These are in the form of regulations, and this particular aspect will be explained. The regulations themselves are extensive documents, but they're very readable, and I certainly commend anybody in the field to look at the website and to access these important documents. A little bit about the background to why the regulation has been brought about. There's been extensive discussion on this topic going back almost 10 years. We've had the recast of the directive, but that was in effect making relatively minor changes. These are much more substantive changes. There's been a lot of debate about the supervision and designation of notified bodies, about post-marketing surveillance, about the need for more transparency, and for the directives to take account of the rapid movement in technology across the sector. Also, of course, there's been the discussions around breast implants in the course of 2011 and 2012, which has influenced the debate. And this is all set out in the explanatory memorandum, and in particular is covered in the first part of the regulation, where the Commission sets out the background as to why it has brought forward these proposals. It was also necessary for the Commission to bring into regulation certain products which fell outside regulatory control. There's been extensive discussion of these proposals involving the public, involving the various professions, involving the industry, and of course the Member States. And as a result of this extensive discussion, the Commission has now brought forward these proposals. So the first question is, why regulation? Well, there are two main reasons for this. The first is that a regulation can be introduced much more rapidly, because once the regulation is agreed, then it automatically becomes international law. If what the Commission had chosen a directive, then this takes a much longer term, because individual Member States have to transpose the legislation into their own laws. And of course there's also the possibility that there may be minor differences in the way one Member State translates the directive as compared to another. So those are the two reasons why the Commission has chosen the regulation. The parliamentary timetable involves discussions not only in the European Parliament, but in parallel, this is called the co-decision process, a discussion and an in-depth consideration by the European Council, bringing together the Member States. Of course, in Europe we have the elections to the European Parliament in June of 2014, which means that the timetable is tight. All the negotiations have to be completed and the legislation will have to be adopted before Easter of 2014. At the present moment, everybody is very keen to get this legislation on the statute book, but it will be tough and we'll have to watch carefully to see how this moves forward. What I'd now like to do is to look at some individual chapters and pick out the key features from them. Chapter 1 looks at the scope of the legislation. The Commission proposes to extend the coverage to include certain non-viable human tissue products, which previously were neither classified as medical devices nor covered under the Advanced Tissue Products Regulation. So we see here that products which are manufactured utilizing non-viable human tissues or cells will be included as medical devices, provided they've undergone substantial manipulation. Non-corrective contact lenses and other aesthetic implants will be brought into the scope of the device legislation, as will ingestive probes. There's also some useful clarification around the borderline with medicinal products, always a difficult area. Chapter 2 sets out the obligations on companies, or as they are referred to by the Commission, economic operations or economic operators. The Commission has proposed to bring in something called CTS, or Common Technical Specifications. Previously, these were only used for in vitro diagnostics. Now the Commission is proposing to use these for medical devices to supplement the previous guidelines, the well-known MedDev guidelines. The difference is that the CTS is much more detailed and more specific. Indeed, some would say it is much more akin to the type of guidelines which are used more frequently in the pharmaceutical sector. Interestingly, this chapter also introduces the concept of a qualified person responsible for regulatory compliance. This individual will have to have a scientific background and 5 years of experience in the regulation of medical devices or in vitro diagnostics. This is an interesting concept. I think we will see more detail as to the requirements for the individual, and I would not be surprised to see this concept extended to other areas in due course. Also in this chapter, there's an importance that there will be an implant card which will be given to all patients who receive an implant to assist in both the monitoring and their subsequent care. And finally in this section, there are interesting proposals which will define more precisely the obligations of someone who reprocesses a single-use device. Reprocessing will still be allowed, but there will be tighter controls on what can be reprocessed and on the obligations of the reprocessor, who in effect will become the new manufacturer. Chapter 3 looks at a range of issues. These are mostly concerned with process and with recording. The first of these is the introduction across Europe of the UDI, the Unique Device Identification. This will be helpful both for post-market surveillance, but also for tracking throughout its journey an individual medical device. There will now be a requirement for the registration of all devices with the European Commission on the UDI database. Previously, only Class 1 devices had to be registered. For high-risk devices, there is a requirement for the company to produce a public safety and performance summary, and this to be supplemented as necessary by the Member States. An important part of raising the profile and increasing the trust of the public in the device and in its approval process. And finally, all this information will be brought together in a European data bank, which will be run by the European Commission. Chapter 4 looks at the very important issue of notified bodies. There are new powers from the Member States to designate a notified body. Supervision will be increased. There will now be teams of 2 Member States and an independent peer reviewer for audits. So, significant tightening of the supervision. There will be joint Member State assessments of the notified bodies. There will also be unannounced inspections of companies by notified bodies. An interesting point is that there will be a rotation of notified body staff. I think the idea here is that staff will not be allowed to remain too long handling a particular company for a notified body. So in effect, bringing a fresh pair of eyes into the evaluation. Chapter 5 looks at classification and conformity assessment. First thing to say is that the 4 classes are maintained. Apheresis machines are moved from class 2B to 3, but the annexes themselves have been tightened, so there's more clarity and more precision. An expert committee will be established for high-risk devices, and there will be an obligation to notified bodies to consult this committee. usually be referred to as the Scrutiny Committee. Its official title is the Medical Device Consultative Committee. So a notified body will undertake an evaluation, but before it makes a decision to recommend the award of the CE mark, it will have to present its evaluation report to this group of European experts, one person nominated from each member state, and they will give an opinion back to the notified body. We understand that that opinion will eventually be made public. It's not necessarily binding on the notified body, but it's hard to imagine a notified body ignoring such an opinion. In effect, this is a second look concept, and there's an opportunity for a particular device to be called in for a 60-day review. This committee will be supported by the European Commission, and its rules are still to be elaborated. But there's quite a lot of information already in Chapter 5 as to how this new, very important committee will operate. Chapter 6 looks at clinical evaluation and clinical investigation. It builds on the old Annex 10 of the Medical Device Directive. There are increased obligations placed on manufacturers, and changes in the way clinical trial approvals will be run. In effect, the Commission is proposing a common single approval for multi-state trials. And for those who are familiar with the clinical trials regulation, which is also going through the Parliament in the same time frame, you'll see that the Commission has effectively adopted the same procedure which it's introducing for pharmaceutical products. So a very similar system has now been put in place of bringing a mutual recognition, a common system between the member states for multi-state trials for devices. And furthermore, the system that will be used for both depositing the application and for controlling the system will be a Commission database which will be common, or rather to use their phrase, will be interoperable with the pharmaceutical clinical trial system. So here we can see the two systems, pharma and devices, being brought together with a common database and with common features. This is obviously a very important chapter and needs to be carefully considered by anybody seeking to bring a new device to the market in Europe. This chapter also looks at increased requirements for clinical evaluation and for the data which is necessary to support successful CE marking in the European Union. Chapter 7 looks at vigilance and market surveillance. It makes the point that surveillance and vigilance are the backbone of the system. It expands on the present concept of having an EU portal for reporting, and it accentuates and confirms the coordinating role of a lead member state when there's an adverse event reported in one country, how that's connected across the European Union. There's also text explaining how market surveillance needs to be enhanced and also better coordinated. So a very key chapter which is giving more detail and more precision as to how post-marketing surveillance and vigilance will be operated over the next decade in Europe. Chapters 8 and Chapters 9 look at governance of the system. And already I referred earlier to this group, the Medical Devices Coordination Group. It will have a coordinating role, but also will have a role, as I explained, to be consulted by notified bodies for the high-risk devices. Alongside and working closely with this new group will be the EU reference laboratories which will be set up. Again, an interesting development. Who will be responsible for all this? Well, there's been much debate. There was a proposal that this might be hosted by the European Medicines Agency, the EMA. There's an alternative proposal that perhaps the Joint Research Centre, the JRC, should host this. The Commission sets out the arguments and comes down with a view that the Commission, should be responsible for coordinating the work of this committee along with the work of the database. We We understand that the Commission has secured a budget line of around €8 million to undertake this work, to set up the database and to move this forward. It's an interesting development and we'll have to see how that works. But it clearly is setting up a new system, a new coordinating centre, presumably in Brussels. Will that move over time? We'll have to wait and see. Chapter 10 then are the final provisions. And here it recognises that the regulation can't set out all the detail. It's looking and suggesting that there will be delegated acts. Those who understand these things, it's called comitology. So we may expect to see Commission regulations, just as we saw in the pharmacovigilance field. In addition, I think we will see a range of guidance produced. So once the legislation is agreed, that will not be the end of the matter. There will be further text. So what is the likely timetable? Well, as I explained earlier, we're probably looking until well into 2014, even if everything goes very smoothly before the legislation is adopted. And then there will be an implementation period. It's likely that the proposals will be phased in over 3 years. So the final elements may not be in place until 2017, but certain key issues will be introduced earlier. So there's no need to panic. We need to keep up to speed. The meetings which Management Forum will be organising are a great opportunity to follow this debate and to get things changed within our organisations as these proposals move forward. And inevitably there will be change introduced both by the Parliament and by the Council of Ministers. I'd now like to turn very briefly to the other directive. There's a lot of commonality here, and this is the piece of legislation, the regulation on in vitro diagnostics. As I said, there's considerable concordance with the MD regulation. Some of the key issues set out on this slide, though, are the improved supervision and better definition of when it's appropriate to use or can use an in-house derogation. And it's made clear that the in-house ability, what in the US is referred to as home brew, should only be used for less high-risk devices. The context here, the text looks at biomarkers, it looks at companion diagnostics, and the change in definition seeks to make the regulation future-proof. So let us look at the proposals in some depth. Firstly, Chapter 1. This defines the scope and the definition. It looks at what are high-risk devices, and it says that where you have a high-risk IVD, these should be subjected to the same controls as if it was manufactured by a commercial operation. This text makes clear that if a diagnostic is to be used to test for the predisposition to a medical condition, it's used to predict an adverse reaction, or it's used to guide a medical therapy, then these are clearly covered as in vitro diagnostics. The reason for this is that previously it had been suggested that if you had a test for identifying a genetic abnormality, that this was not itself an in vitro diagnostic. Now made clear that this is an in vitro diagnostic, and these will be classified in the higher risk category. There's also elaboration about the medical software. This is software in support of in vitro diagnostics. And wherever possible, the Commission seems to very helpfully use the definitions from the GHTF, the Global Harmonisation Task Force. In Chapter 2, we see some of the similar issues for medical devices. We see the qualified person, we see the UDIs, we see the central database. In Chapter 4, we see the same proposals for notified bodies who are qualified in this area. In Chapter 5 on classification, we see now 4 classes of IVDs, A, B, C, D. We also see there's streamlined and tightened concordance controls, and again there is a consultation with an expert committee for the higher risk in vitro diagnostics. So almost a mirror image of the medical device regulation is set out here for IVDs. What is interesting is the risk determination is in effect turned around, and now the regulation specifies that if you are a new in vitro diagnostic, you're assumed to be in a higher risk, whereas previously the definition was if you were a new device, you fell into the lower category, which was self-regulation. So this is how the Commission has rather elegantly made the proposals future-proof. In Chapter 6, we have an interesting discussion around clinical evidence and how field trials are going to be controlled. We have some better language in Chapter 7 around vigilance and PMS for in vitro diagnostics, recognising that previously the language was used for that of a medical device, whereas in vitro diagnostic is a very different category of products. The governance chapters, chapters 8 and 9, are almost identical for the medical devices, as is chapter 10 for final provisions. So what we have seen in these regulations are a significant change for the system to be used in Europe. But what we do see is that they build on the existing regulations. The notified bodies remain the key control point, but they're supplemented by the scrutiny committee. They're supplemented by the availability now of scientific advice, which can be given to companies to aid development. So there's some very good features here. There are some features which will be more controversial. The Commission has done a great job of listening to all the interested parties. Whether that will be sufficient to satisfy everybody, only time will tell. What is clear is that we all need to follow these proposals very closely and to make assessments and to make changes within the way we are evaluating medical devices and to be aware of the impact that this will have across the sector. I hope this brief exposition has been helpful to everybody and sets the scene for both where we are now and will enable you to follow these with the help of external meetings and other interactions over what is going to be a most interesting year as we face up to the challenges of new regulation and new controls. Thank you very much for listening.
Fantastic, David. Thank you. That was brilliant. Really, really good.